everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yep, great. Perfect. I and my colleagues Belinda and Emily are delighted to be with you here today and share a project that we were very passionate about and we just love doing, so very excited about that. My name is Dr. Kerstin Oberpriele. I describe what I do as a behavioural and gamification designer. I've got my PhD from UC, represent, and I work with government, private industries and educational institutions. Should I pass this over to you? Oh, it's stuck.
Hi, I'm Belinda. My background is in psychology and marketing. Marketing, I did a qualitative research thesis. I have worked with Kerstin in her gamification startup, and then we moved over to ThinkPlace to start up the behavioural design practice. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name's Emily Clay. I also work with Belinda and Kerstin, and very similarly to Belinda, got my psychology and business majoring and marketing degree at UC as well, so represent UC. And yeah, like Belinda, I did psychology honours, which was a quantitative honours, but we do a lot of qualitative research, which we're going to talk about today.
Should we swap?
Yes. Okay, so the challenge of what the project was that we did, which is a Women in Aviation project, and the challenge that the aviation industry in Australia was facing is that women made up less than 20% of the workforce within the Australian aviation industry, which is a massive underrepresentation. And then when you look at technical roles, so think mechanics, engineers, that number dropped to 4%. The sector is facing a critical skills shortage. I'm sure you've heard about it in the media. And gender diversity results in improved performance, attraction and retention, a better safety culture, economic and financial gains. So if you get more women to join the workforce, not only are you tackling that critical skills shortage, but you also have all of these incredible outcomes, which is what the literature has said. And so the Women in Aviation Fund has received $8 million of funding since 2019, which really shows government's commitment to improving gender diversity. So our approach to this problem. So up here we've got our behavioural design methodology, and in the interest of time I won't go too much into detail because it'll evolve as we talk throughout our presentation. But the key three phases are discover, design and deploy. And in our discover phase, this is where we are conducting our literature review, our desktop research. We're looking at academic sources, industry sources. We're looking across STEM, culture, leadership, gender diversity. So really trying to get that multidisciplinary view. We then conducted a total of 33 interviews with 19 different organisations, made up of men and women as well as gender diverse people. And we use that evidence to then inform our design of our nudges and interventions, which we were then lucky enough to deploy and test in a trial. And you can see on the right-hand side here, these are some key reports that we delivered to our client, and they actually are kind of broken into these three phases. So up here we've got a behavioural systems map, and this is a really cool way of mapping a system holistically, focusing on the behaviours, the actors, the influences. And I know it is a bit hard to see, and the aviation industry is really complex to map, but from what we have up here, we start with our early career women in the aviation industry, moving to mid-career and then moving to late career. And what this map shows is that a feeling of isolation and a feeling of lack of belonging was a critical factor for women early to mid in their career as to whether they're actually going to remain in the industry. However, this behaviour is actually mediated by the behaviours of their colleagues, mentors, friends, support networks around them, and that diversity valuing behaviour was really key in women actually staying in the industry. And that's further supported by the mentoring and sponsorship that those women early to mid in their career were receiving. And we focus here on this middle section, which is where our project mainly focused, which was that early to mid-career. The negative influences, which are the orangey red, they are more of the gender biased behaviours. So when women early to early to mid in their career are faced with those negative influences, it had a negative outcome. But we did see those positive influences, which is that supportive behaviour. So up here we have our process. So the theory that we proposed for this project was the COM-B model, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, and the theoretical domains framework. And we use this as an evidence base throughout our project in the design of our interventions and our nudges. So you can see here, we'll talk through these in a bit more detail, but we started with psychographic dimensions, moving to prioritising our key behaviours, and then mapping those behaviours to each of our interventions. And we made sure we kept referring back to that COM-B model as our evidence base throughout the project. And really briefly, I'm just going to touch on some of the research insights that came out from those 33 interviews that we did, as well as that desktop review. Number one, women in aviation often feel as though they do not belong. That was key in that behavioural systems map. Pretty self-explanatory, but it was a really important finding. Number two, women face gender-biased challenges that affect retention in the industry. Again, pretty self-explanatory, but that gender-based was really key. Passion and family connections helped to overcome gender barriers. So women who really felt that call to action, the passion for aviation, they persevered throughout their gender-biased interactions. And those women who did have family connections did often find it a little bit easier to join the industry. Leaders and leadership behaviours are pivotal in the career trajectory of women in aviation. Aviation is constantly evolving. Think tech, societal issues, yet the prevalent biases, social norms and discriminations unfortunately still remains a challenge. And effective allies and support mechanisms are an enabler for women to persevere in the industry.
I'm going to talk a bit about the design phase. So we started out by creating psychographic profiles. And so you have demographic profiles, which are like age, income, SES. And then you have psychographic profiles, which are what are your beliefs, what life stage are you at, what are your attitudes towards certain things. And so some of our psychographic profiles, we had a sky dreamer. This is a young woman who's early in her career. She's really passionate, keen to get into the industry, but maybe needs to build up a bit of resilience to work in the industry. We had a crossroad contemplator. So this is a woman who is she's kind of at a pivotal point where she needs to decide, does she want to have a family? Does she want to progress in leadership roles? Because the industry just is not very supportive of both at the moment. We had what we called Wings of Empowerment, which is that woman who's a trailblazer. She's lifting women up with her, paving the way for the next generation. An aspiring advocate. In some of our desktop research, we found often men with daughters are more supportive of other women or of young women in the industry. So this is a guy who's keen to create a supportive space, but maybe needs a little bit more support to be an ally. Our patriarchal pilot, who is your stereotypical traditionalist senior captain who often makes remarks about young females in the workplace and makes it an uncomfortable place. And then we had our aviator ally who really wants to be that strong supporter for women in the industry and isn't afraid to be shut down by his male colleagues standing up for the women. So once we had our psychographic profiles, we then looked at what behaviour do we want to change. And so we mapped out, we had from our research a bunch of behaviours, and then we mapped them out on this graph, which was ease of adoption versus level of impact. So those behaviours that are easy to adopt and have big impact, those are our quick wins. So for us, that was kind of that space we wanted to play in, where we could have those quick wins. But then we also had those harder to adopt and big impact behaviours, and those were going to be our big wins and shift the dial in the industry. And so I know Kerstin will go into these target behaviours a little bit, but I'll breeze through them. So we had being aware of gender bias and potential issues in an aviation career. We had speaking up and responding to negative comments when they're directed at oneself, and then speaking up and responding when they were directed at a colleague, so standing up for someone else. We had knowing how to respond when your comment is shut down. So you make a comment, someone says, oh, that's not on. How do you then respond to that? and then engaging in conversations with male and female colleagues about reducing that bias. So I won't go into too much detail about what our nudges were, but I encourage you to come and speak to us afterwards. But one theme that kept coming up in our interviews was, I wish I had the tools in my toolbox to know how to respond to a comment, how to stand up for a colleague. And so in a lot of our nudges, we really focused on that toolkit and tools in the toolbox. So once we had designed and brainstormed our nudges, we then mapped them to the target behaviours. So we wanted to make sure our interventions were designed for the end user and to shift the behaviour of that end user. So kind of, mapping out the psychographics, the behaviours, and then the interventions. Our trial had 230 participants. We worked with 4 aviation organisations across 4 states and territories, and our trials ran for 4 weeks across those. We had pilots, students, engineers, and mechanics. We worked with a small regional airline, a big commercial airline, a training provider, and then an engineering team. So I'll go into a few of our interventions. We had this Speak Up poster, which was a bit of a play on a safety card you find in the back of your aeroplane seat. And this was those 5 easy to remember ways to address comments or respond to comments. And this was really to provide that quick, easy tools in your toolbox. How do you respond to these comments? We had an unconscious bias poster, which is a bit satirical, but kind of flipping that narrative. So we had a picture of a male mechanic saying, oh, well, he's doing pretty well for a man, or it's interesting to see a male working in this field, and then had this tagline of, if it sounds ridiculous, that's because it is, and these are comments that women are constantly facing in the industry. We had these social objects, so one theme that kept coming out was, it's just a big boys' club. Like, after work, they'll go and play golf, they'll have a beer, and the women often just aren't invited, and then they're left on the outside. And so we're like, okay, how can we get this messaging of let's fly fair, which was one of our interventions or our tagline, how can we get that in these spaces? So we designed stubby coolers and golf balls so that that messaging was kind of always there. And then the last one I'll touch on is we made a few games. So we had a deck of cards and we had this kind of take off snakes and ladders. So the ladders are the things that build the women up in the industry. So things like inclusive policies or speaking up for yourself and others. And then the slides are the things that knock women back in the industry. So those negative comments, a lack of role models. Yeah, I think I'll pass over to Kerstin.
Awesome. Well, what did we find? Bet you're dying to know. Was it good? Was it bad? Let's find out. I'm just building up the suspense while the slide. Here we go. Okay. So for the results, we did a pre and post study of the 4 organisations and compared across. So these are the summary results. So overall, there was a 42% positive change in behaviour in people, in themselves, and in others that they saw. So self-reported saying, I'm feeling more confident, and I was receiving fewer biased comments. Interestingly, we tested a range of different factors. Interestingly, the perception of there are opportunities to progress in my organisation increased by 11%. So that was just an interesting, I guess, side benefit. And then an interesting, whatever the opposite of benefit is, negative one, was a perception of fairness in recruitment. So that went down a little bit. People's self-efficacy in terms of knowing how to stand up against inappropriate behaviour increased by 11%, and in general, there were fewer of these comments being made. So this was across the board, but there are differences between the organisations. But before I dive into those, again, coming back to those target behaviours, those prioritised target behaviours, we wanted to know, did our interventions, did they work in shifting those target behaviours? And they did for those different people. So again, fair bit of detail on the slide there, but just to say that each of those behaviours we were able to nudge in the right direction, which was fantastic. Now, across the organisations, it did differ. So again, don't know how much detail to kind of go into. We've got about 5 minutes left, but we saw on the general aviation organisation extremely positive. So rather than the 43%, it was actually 71%. So they saw a really, really big difference, and then sort of less difference for some. And you can see again, this general aviation one had positive markers on all of those results, whereas some of the others had the negative ones, and that's where we got those final figures from. So that's interesting. It begs the question, why the difference? What was different about the organisations? So there was a couple of things that when we're doing this cross comparison that we found were similar across the organisations versus what were different. So similarities were that both men and women work quite closely together, and there's quite a lot of organisational pride. They all faced gender bias issues, and the women all reported experiencing this. The leadership role was important for all of those. And in general, there was this feeling of being underprepared to address gender bias. So that's what was the same. But what was different, so the demographics and the role. So again, some of our organisations that were more technical, they had some more of those more negative results. The smaller organisation had the more positive results than the larger ones. There was some difference in terms of how proactive versus how reactive organisations were being. So some of the larger organisations had systems, processes, committees in place, and the smaller ones didn't. There was also differences in the physical environment. Again, if you're on the engineering floor versus a pilot and so forth. And then interaction with external people. So again, the pilots would also receive the female pilots would also receive comments from the customers, whereas if you're on the engineering floor, you're not engaging directly with customers. So again, coming back to the theory, we found that the theory did explain some of those things that we saw. So our COMBI and our theoretical domains framework did talk about, how do we increase the capability and the opportunity and the motivation, and it looked like the interventions did increase those things. Social context theory and social identity theory we also found were coming into play. So really, a lot of the interventions allowed for a structured positive discussion. So things like the games allowed people to, games tend to put people in a more playful, social, interactive mode. And so it allowed people to have those discussions. Things like the unconscious bias poster, again, using humour and in a non-threatening way, doesn't threaten the high status group. We're just kind of making a little joke and using humour to cut through that messaging. And it was interesting as well that when we talk about, hey, we need to address gender bias, there was a little bit of reactance from some of the men. Again, research shows that the high status groups, if they're feeling threatened by what you're saying, because they have, the high status to lose, can sometimes react to that. So we did see that in a few of the organisations. I think I'm getting my warnings there for time. So the takeaway really is that these results were really quite positive in a short amount of time. And the interventions are relatively low cost and scalable. So that's a really, really positive thing. And again, shows just the power of putting in some of these simple things within an environment to shift really quite socially ingrained behaviour that's, that's normative across the industry. So yeah, really exciting, positive results, small amount of time, scalable nudges. And we'll kind of leave it there, but just to kind of say this, the purpose of this project was to run, not a pilot, a trial, can't use that word in this industry, to run a trial to make sure that we did have something that was working, and of course to make sure that our interventions were not causing harm. So it was deliberately that initial trial as part of the methodology. Thank you, happy to take questions. The trial itself was 4 weeks, and the project was about 7 or 8 months. Yeah, and pretty, a pretty detailed focus on this project over the 7 months. But yeah, 4 weeks. Thank you.
It looked like engineers didn't do as well. What do you lay that off to? Was that more male dominant, I would say, or what do you think was the rationale?
Yeah, I'll answer, then I'll also invite my colleagues to add anything. Absolutely, the technical roles within aviation, the women's representation is as low as 4%. So you definitely have a lot more traditional male-dominated. Some of the biases around, well, women can't lift the heavy things, or why is the woman, why does she like playing with engines? Surely she'd rather be, doing something else. So definitely a lot more ingrained roles there. Do you want to add anything?
I think
Probably don't need it. Yeah.
but one other, I guess, interesting thing in that space was there was a real lack of mentorship and mentors, like you can't be what you can't see. And so I think probably for both young female and male engineers, not seeing that women at senior leadership either, I reckon that would have played into it as well.
And in one of the engineering organisations, it was interesting in terms of the physical spaces. Women didn't have a separate change room or bathroom because, these infrastructure gets built decades ago when, that wasn't so much of a thing. So some of the women to wash up, and as a mechanic you get quite dirty, have to walk through the office just to, look after their hygiene. So a lot of those factors coming into play as well. Yeah. But again, we would love to do a further study and kind of dive into some of those differences even more.
So the focus here has been about retaining staff, female women, people that we've managed to get into the business. And we've seen, obviously, your results demonstrate a lot of attitudinal or self-belief about their changes. And I'm sorry if I missed it, because there was a lot of presentation there. So do you know what the retention, has there been any change in the retention, or do you have to go back to measure that?
I don't think that was one of the measures that we did.
Because it was only a 4-week trial.
Yeah, that's what I'm sort of
Yeah.
I guess, are you having a follow-up study to see what the retention's been?
We'd love to.
So I'm just thinking, sometimes you have short-term changes in attitude.
Yes.
But you don't have that long-term shift. So it'd be really interesting to see about the retention rates.
Yeah, it would be really interesting, and even just for us to kind of follow up with those trial partners to see how they're going. Because, for example, the smaller regional aviation company, it felt like their leadership was really behind it, and they were all really getting on board, and they were even including some of our interventions as part of their induction. So, you'd hope that some of those changes would be more systemic and long-term. But yeah, that would be definitely worth a follow-up.
Another project.
Yeah. I think you had a hand up.
When did you, so you did a pre and post survey, obviously. When did you do the pre one? Was it at the beginning of the 4 weeks or like way back?
Yeah. Do you want to answer that one, Emma?
Yeah, sure. It was at the beginning of the 4 weeks. So throughout our design phase, we were also recruiting our trial participants. So we designed a survey then, and then we rolled out the survey pre-testing the interventions, and then also post as well.
Yeah.
But I think we would have loved to have done it way back, because even, especially with that general aviation company, even just interviewing people and talking about it was already starting to shift that behaviour. So we did recognise that as a bit of a limitation, that I think if we were to do it again, doing that baseline survey way at the beginning before any of the awareness was starting to form would have been really helpful.
Yeah, because I was thinking you'd probably see more of a change, and you already saw a big, like amazing change. So
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those learnings. Yeah.
So with the interventions, is the idea to roll those out in just other aviation businesses, or would these go into, could you use the same types of interventions in other sort of male-dominated industries, or would you need them to be more tailored to what that industry is?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely one we've thought about. So absolutely the interventions are kind of ready to implement across any aviation organisation. And a lot of them would be applicable to other non-aviation organisations as well. Some of them are specifically tailored, like the unconscious bias poster, we've got the, things like that. Even in the toolkit and things, we made sure that it was focused on the aviation industry and some of the statistics. And I think that tailoring to the aviation industry is part of its success. But it really wouldn't take that much to make them more generic.
Same idea, you could just tailor it to whatever the statistics were in whatever industry.
Yeah, quite potentially. Yeah. You all make me want to dive back in now.
I was just wondering if there was a difference within any of the different locations and places that you worked with between how competitive the environment was for how much freedom people felt they had to actually move employers if the culture wasn't a good fit. I can imagine that the aviation industry would be one where you would feel very restricted in what you could actually access if the culture wasn't moving with you and how much that might play a role in sort of it.
I think, especially in the general aviation, so from our interviews, it seemed like you kind of had to go through to get into the industry, you go into general, and then you move on to commercial, and that's the goal. Some people drive around the country for over a year trying to get a job. They literally pack everything up in their car and they drive around and they go on resume drop around the country. So I think if the culture wasn't fitting, you grit your teeth and you get through it, was my understanding.
And I think that's when you did see some of those women early to mid in their career just leave, because in a lot of those companies there wasn't really another option, which is really sad because then we're losing all these amazing talented women from the industry.
And even going from, once you've got your first job at a small airline flying, regional scenic tours and things like that, and then trying to get into some different types of aircraft and different types of roles, even then women are facing bias. So that they may be more qualified in terms of are able to land on different airstrips and fly different planes and different things, but would still be passed over for a man with less experience. Again, that gender bias. So even once you have to work hard to get in, even if you've done the same training as your male colleagues, but then hard to, continue. So yeah, and definitely, and this is why this project was funded by the government, because it's such a huge issue. Yeah.
A lot of pilots tend to come out of the military. Are the same biases there, gender representation?
We didn't study that, or we didn't have a partner that was part of the military, but I would dare say yes. We did speak to some in the interviews.
Yeah, we did speak to quite a few, either current serving or ex-defence Air Force pilots and engineers, also air traffic control. And I think from their experience it was still very much the case. But yeah, I think we would love to drill more into the defence side of things. But there has been a lot of research already done in that space, which is really interesting. Yeah, I want to read that.
I was just going to say, there's so many barriers there. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Not really surprising, unfortunately, but
Yeah.
yeah. This is just a comment. What you said about the bathrooms reminded me of my daughter who did vacation work for Grain Corp, and that's very male dominated. And to go to the bathroom, if she was working out in the bales or like the pits for the scene, it was like a 20-minute walk, and the boys could just get out and pee on the side. But just a simple thing like the bathrooms.
Yeah. And we've
Not that hard to fix.
Yeah, and it's such a barrier, and it's you do see it these days still. And we don't think about it with gender bias, this esoterical thing, but this is exactly how it manifests. And definitely early on in the project, we were definitely experiencing that VUCA, not the delicious VUCA, but the overwhelming VUCA, which is why the behavioural system map really helped. To be like, oh my God, there's so much complexity here. Where do we focus our attention for this trial? So yeah, definitely hugely complex. Definitely, and I think we had to come to grips with the fact that we couldn't solve this problem overnight through one project as much as we might want to, and that it will take, death by 1,000 cuts sort of thing over decades to solve this issue. Yeah. Don't know how we're going for time.
Thank you. Yes, I'm timed. So
Great. Thank you.